so today is the first of a series of reviews about live instrument microphones. These are microphones that you put onto your instrument so that you can play it in a loud, amplified setting or with a set of louder instruments than yours, like the drums or a vocalist with a microphone, electric guitar, what have you, so that you can be on stage with them, be amplified, and be able to sort of play and be heard. So the first that we're going to be reviewing today is the DPA Devote 4099 live instrument microphones. Now these microphones are $600 a piece, and I have two of them, one up here and one down here, that are attached to my instrument, so that's $1,240 worth of microphones. These are the same microphones that they sell for all instruments. So you can use these microphones on a violin, an accordion, a trombone, saxophone, bass clarinet, what have you. These are the same microphones. The only difference is that they sell different clip attachments so that you can get the microphones to attach to your instrument. So obviously today I'm going to be talking about the bass clarinet, but these microphones do work on a whole range of instruments. First though, we're going to be talking about what to look for in a live microphone. The most important thing that I'm going to be looking for in a live microphone is how it sounds, obviously. I want these microphones to pick up the sound of my bass clarinet and simply make it louder. I don't want them to change the way my instrument sounds, and that's what we call in microphone language coloring the sound. We want it to just be a transparent, louder version of the sound of the instrument itself. So that's the first important thing that you're going to be looking for, is how well does it capture the actual sound of your instrument when you're playing it. The second thing we're going to be looking at is handling noise. Handling noise is the sound the instrument makes just by pushing keys down. And it becomes important with an instrument with a lot of keys, like a saxophone or a bass clarinet, because we don't want the microphones to pick up the keys clanking, but they're inevitably going to do some of that. So how much handling noise do these microphones pick up? I'll show you what that means just really quickly. Third of all is, how do they attach to the instrument? Some instruments are easy to attach to. When you have something more complicated like a saxophone or especially a bass clarinet, it becomes a challenge to figure out how to hook this darn thing, or two of them if that's the case, onto your instruments. Next, we're going to be talking about cable management. Regardless of whether you have a wireless or a wired system, the likelihood is that you will have wires of some sort coming out of your microphones and going either down to the ground or to some kind of a wireless belt pack that you hook onto your body. Either way, you have to worry about the wires out of the microphones not getting caught in your keys, not getting stuck underneath pads. So figuring out how to weave that through your instrument so that that is not a factor is something that we're going to talk about briefly. And finally, we're going to talk about feedback. Feedback is that phenomenon where when you have a microphone too close to a speaker, it creates a squeal. And what technically is happening is the sound that's coming out of the speaker goes into the microphone, and then it goes back into the speaker, and it creates this feedback loop, which creates this kind of a squeal or a low rumble. Microphone engineers design microphones with polar patterns and frequency response curves to eliminate, or at least reduce as much as possible, that phenomenon of feedback, because that's something that you absolutely want to avoid. It's a lot to cover, so let's get started. This is the microphone itself. It has a gooseneck, which allows you to adjust the microphone to point it at different parts of the instrument if you need to, which I do. At the top of the gooseneck is the capsule. The capsule is underneath a windscreen, which reduces some wind noise if you're playing outdoors. And there are two rubber decouplers here. They suspend this capsule from the gooseneck itself. And the reason that the engineers did this is so that the mechanical noise, or what I'm calling handling noise, is reduced, because the vibrations that come through the gooseneck itself are reduced when the microphone is sort of suspended above it and not attached to it. The gooseneck is about 4 inches, and if you need to, you can get an extension gooseneck, which just screws into the bottom of it, which adds another, I don't know, let's say 6 centimeters or 2 or 3 inches to it. And I find this useful. I needed it for the top microphone that I use, for the top joint of the bass clarinet. This is just one of the many attachments that DPA sells with the microphone. This is what they call the universal attachment, and this would allow you to put it around any sort of a tube, like a clarinet or a bass clarinet, and you run this Velcro strip through. It creates a loop, and you can sort of tighten it however tightly you need it and wrap it around itself. And then the microphone itself clips into there. So what I did was, with my bass clarinet, I had to find a spot on the instrument itself where the strap would not interfere with any of the pads or any of the rods. And the only place I could find was down here. So I've actually attached it underneath. This is below my low E key and above my low E flat key, and the strap goes really well beneath it, and over to the side there is an area where there are no keys, no pads, no rods, no nothing, and that's where the body of this attachment will sit. So this is firmly attached. There's a rubber base here. It's strapped in pretty well with the Velcro, and this is where the microphone itself will go. So you take the gooseneck and you slide it into this little clip at the top. It's rubber, so it just sits there. And then you take this lock that slides down over the rubber. Now you need to push the lock down, otherwise this microphone can just pop right out. But with the lock in place, so put it down, and I slide the lock over it, like so, this isn't going anywhere. Now once this is on, the first instinct that a lot of people have is to point the microphone at the bell. That is a huge no-no, nuh-uh, because the sound of a bass clarinet does not entirely come out the bell. In fact, most of the sound of the bass clarinet comes out the entire range of all of the keys and pads that are opening up. So you don't want to point this at the bell unless all you want to capture is the low C or the low E flat if you have a low E flat bass clarinet. Instead, you want to flip this microphone around 180 degrees so that it points up towards your right hand, like so. So right now, this capsule is pointing toward my right hand. It's capturing all of the sound from here down. And it is not entirely rejecting sound out of the bell because it's slightly off axis, so it's still picking a little bit of it up in the capsule, but it's not only going to pick it up. The reason this is important is you want an even sound where the scale, it doesn't just favor these bottom notes, but it captures everything. Now, you can use this microphone just like so. If you only want to purchase one of them, if you just sort of point it up toward the instrument, this will work. First person that I talked to at DPA told me this, and I did not believe him, but it's actually true, and I'll show you that in the sound tests in a minute. But because I use two microphones with my AMT, I wanted to figure out a way to get a second one attached. Now this was tricky. So now moving to the top joint, I had this second universal Velcro clamp. And I figured maybe I could figure out a way to get this to fit on, like, right about here where there are no pads and no rods or anything, just like I did with the bottom joint. The issue was that when I would slide this piece of Velcro through, no matter where I fit it, it was either going to get stopped by a post here or it's going to sort of, interfere with a pad or a hole. It just wasn't going to work. So I thought I was going to be out of luck and only be able to use the bottom microphone. But then I took a look at some of the other attachments they gave me, and I saw this little thing. This is, I think, what they use to attach microphones to an accordion. It had 3 holes in it here, so I could feed a screw through it. Now, I obviously could drill a hole in my instrument and attach it to the instrument permanently, but I wasn't about to do that. But then I looked down here at the bottom between the two joints, and I have this alignment screw, and I have my thumb rest screw, both of which I can unscrew and remove and feed through, like so, screw it back in, and I can attach the microphone clip this way. It can either go horizontally, or I can slide it up, and I found that what was best for me is that I had it running vertically to the instrument so that the microphone would come out the side like so. So let's do that. Now, like I said, I needed to put this gooseneck extension on it because I want to feed it around to the front of the bass clarinet so that it's capturing, obviously, where the sound comes out, because no sound's coming out back here, really. Clip that in like I do with the other bottom microphone, like I showed you, and I slide this lock up on top, like so. And then I can feed the microphone around the front and point it wherever I want towards these keys, which is what I recommend. So the two microphones together, this captures the sound from the bottom of the instrument, and this captures the sound from the top of the instrument. And it wound up being really even and wonderful. So let's look at what this thing sounds like. We're going to analyze the sound of these microphones 2 different ways. And the first way we're going to be doing so is looking at a waveform. And this is a waveform of a 4-octave chromatic scale on the bass clarinet. Now, ideally, with a microphone, you want this waveform to look fairly even across the entire range of the instrument. In other words, we don't want quiet portions and loud portions, and we certainly don't want certain notes to stick out. Now, what we see here is that at the low end of the bass clarinet, the waveform is not as large as when we're getting toward, the top of the clarion register here. But what we're seeing is that there's a dip in the middle, and then there's a dip at the very beginning. So let's give this a listen and see if it sounds the way it looks. So to me, despite the fact that it doesn't look super even. It sounds pretty even between the two of them. And I really like the timbre, which we'll get into in a second, of the Clarion register. But here's the thing that totally blew me away. When I was speaking to the representative from DPA, he told me, you know what, you really only need one microphone. And I said to him, no possible way that you could pick up all of the bass clarinet range with one microphone. It'll pick up the low notes, but then it'll get really quiet at the top. He says, try it, you'll be surprised. So I tried it, and I was surprised. This is what the single microphone pickup waveform looks like. Now, I was expecting the area here, sort of the furthest away from the microphone capsule itself, would be really quiet, but it's not. Now, what I did find, despite the fact that it looks like it is fairly even, it did get a little bit thin sounding when I got further away from the microphone, both sort of toward the top of the Shalomar register and the top of the Clarion register. So I didn't like the sound of one microphone as much, but he was right. It did pick up the bass clarinet really evenly, and surprisingly so. Here, have a listen. For the sake of comparison, this is the waveform of my usual microphone, which are the Applied Microphone Technology mics that I've been using on my bass clarinet for the last 22 years. Now, back in 1997 or so, when I was first looking for microphones for the bass clarinet, I really couldn't find any because they didn't exist. There was no clamp that allowed a microphone to sit at the right place on an instrument, so the guys at AMT had to invent one for me. And the microphones that they chose, they had very specific pickup patterns so that they would pick up the bass clarinet but not feed back. We basically had to build these from the ground up, and I've been using them ever since, and I've been thinking of these as the gold standard. So when I got the DPAs, I was like, well, we'll see how well they stand up. Well, here's the thing. They kind of blow my AMTs away. And you can see just from this waveform how unevenly the microphones pick up the full range of the bass clarinet. So let's give this a quick listen for comparison's sake. You can kind of hear the waves where the sound gets louder and then it gets quieter and louder again. You can hear it, and you can definitely see it in these microphones. And the other thing is that the microphones don't have the same brightness. They don't capture all of the high frequencies that the DPA microphones do. Now, in some senses, that's actually a good thing for me, because the high frequencies in an amplified setting are often the ones that will begin to feed back first. So probably with the DPAs, I'm going to have to filter those out, but it's nice to have them to begin with to filter out, whereas the AMTs just simply don't capture those frequencies. So now that we've talked about evenness of the range, let's take a look at a spectrograph that shows a fingerprint of the sound that the microphones pick up. What we have here is a spectrograph of those three chromatic scales we were just looking at the waveforms from. On the left is the DPA, one microphone setup just at the bottom. In the middle is the two microphone setup for DPA, and on the right is my usual AMT microphones. Now, a spectrograph is the sort of fingerprint of a sound. On the right side of the screen, you can see frequency from 100 hertz at the bottom, which is low, to 20,000 hertz at the top. And this represents just about the full range of human hearing. And these microphones, the idea is not for them to pick up all of it evenly, because it's not coming out of the bass clarinet evenly. The bass clarinet has its own fingerprint. Now, how you read a spectrograph is, in this particular case, looking at how much white or blue is in each individual note. Now, you can kind of see on the far right side of each of these, this is the high C that I'm playing. That's the highest note of that chromatic scale, super high C. And what we're seeing here is the frequencies of that note. That high C is about 1,000 hertz. And then we're looking at the overtone series of the bass clarinet going all the way up to the top. Now, the bass clarinet produces these overtones, and we want the microphones to capture these overtones as the bass clarinet produces them. Now, looking at the two DPA recordings, again, the one in the middle is the two microphone setup, we see, generally speaking, that if there's more color up toward the top, that means that those microphones are picking up frequencies that the AMT microphones are not. So as I was saying, the AMT microphones sound a little bit darker, and therefore that means that they are not picking up as many of those high frequencies that the bass clarinet is clearly producing, because you can see that the DPA microphones are picking those up. Now let's talk about handling noise or mechanical noise. What you're looking at here is a spectrograph of me just playing those chromatic scales by fingering them but not blowing into the instrument, because I just wanted to capture the sound the instrument made, just the keys as I'm playing it. And what you can see with the DPAs, both one microphone and two microphone setups, is that there's a lot more low frequency activity from about 100 hertz all the way up through 500 or 600 hertz. Now, what that sounds like is when I'm playing the notes and I'm actually blowing through the instrument, you can hear the thump of those keys. Here's what that sounds like, just a recording of me playing the chromatic scale and fingering it, but not blowing. So you can really hear the low frequency activity, especially if you're wearing headphones. You can hear that thumpiness. Let's listen to the AMT, but first let's take a look. You can see that there's a lot less activity in the low frequencies. So you're still going to hear the clicks. There's no question. There's no way to avoid it. But you're not hearing as much thuddiness, low frequency thump in those clicks. Here's what that sounds like. Now, I don't know about you, but I can really hear the difference in that the AMT is not picking up those low frequency thumps that the DPA microphones do. And I prefer it to the DPAs for that reason. Now, you could say, hey, I'll just filter out those low frequencies from the DPA. But the problem is that this is a bass clarinet, and the bass clarinet actually goes down into those low frequencies. So if you filter it out because you don't want the mechanical noise, you're actually filtering out some of the low frequency of the bass clarinet itself. And that obviously is not something that you want to do. So if I'm going to use these DPA microphones, I'm going to probably have to figure out a different attachment mechanism, and I may have to invent one myself so that it decouples them further from the bass clarinet, because right now they're attached to the body of the instrument itself, and I think that's why they're picking up some of those low frequencies that the AMTs are not. So in this particular case, it's a bit of a toss-up. I prefer the AMTs because they don't have as much mechanical noise as the DPAs do. Okay, let's talk about cables and cable management. This is the cable that comes with it. It's about 6 feet long. One end of it will screw into this XLR plug, which then you can plug into another microphone cable to extend its length. And this screws into the microphone itself, which is great. Some microphones do not have removable cables. You kind of want to have ones that do, because cables, especially ones that are thin like this, are going to break. Something's going to happen to them, and you want to be able to carry it back up. If the cable itself is attached permanently to the microphone, you're screwed. So now looking down toward the bottom of the instrument, this is now the attached wire. I don't want it flopping around. If it flops around, it could flop into one of these keys, and it has a really nasty habit of flopping into the low C key. So what I do is I bring it down, and I found this works. I wrap it once around where the peg attaches to the bell of the bass clarinet, and then I have this little plastic coated wire. I get these on Amazon, they're like $1. And I bring it through the bell without, touching any of the rods or inhibiting the movement of the pad, and I just kind of twist it like so. This keeps this cable taut. It keeps it away from this low C because it's on this side. Now, because I have two microphones, I have a second cable I have to deal with. So I'm going to bring this around as well. I'm going to unhook the rubber thing that I use to attach the other cable. I'll bring this one around as well, so they're both at the same, coming around the same way. And then I will clamp this again. Now I have two cables that are not impeding the movement of any of the rods, and they're not going to get in the way of any of the pads. And then I'm good to go. Okay, so let's give it a listen. Quick thing I need to mention before I play is that these microphones require phantom power because they are condenser microphones. Microphones that you're used to seeing like in a singing microphone, those are dynamic microphones most often. They don't require phantom power, and you can plug it straight into the speaker. These, because they require phantom power, they need to go through a mixer that will provide it, and then that mixer goes into the speaker. By the way, this speaker is a JBL Eon 1. I've had it for a long time. It's a great portable PA that I can use when I go to a place that doesn't have a PA, for example. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to play a little Bach, because if Bach had an amplifier, you know he would be using it. And I'm going to play with the volume turned all the way down, so you're just hearing the bass clarinet and not the microphones. So now that I've turned the volume up, what we want to hear is just a louder bass clarinet. I'll play the same thing again. This is turned up to, I don't know, 11. So that's what it sounds like, just louder. It's not so bad. I can hear a little bit of the unevenness, right? Some of the notes will stick out. I bet you can hear that too. So briefly, before we close, I'd like to talk about feedback. Now, feedback again is where the sound that's coming out of the speaker goes into the microphones and then it goes back into the speaker and it creates this kind of whistling feedback loop. Now, because these microphones, as we saw, have a really good high frequency response in the upper range, I found that they tend to feedback in that high range as well. And you can hear that when I bring this a little bit closer to the speaker. It's mostly up there. The great thing about that is you can always roll that off a little bit with an equalizer, or even on your mixer, the high end of your mixer, and you won't really affect the sound of the bass clarinet that much, because those frequencies high up there, they're so far above any sound, any fundamental sound that the bass clarinet makes, you can tend to roll them off and it won't create too much of a problem. So that's kind of cool. So in closing, these DPA mics are fantastic. By far better sounding than any other microphone I've had on my bass clarinet. They are on the high end of the price spectrum at $1,240 for both of them. Now, you can get away with one of them, as we can see. For just $620, you can start with one of them, and it is actually a really good value for the sound that it gives you. Now, you can also take this and put this on your clarinet or your saxophone really easy using the different attachment clamps that DPA offers, so that's a plus as well. The downside of it, again, is I don't like the low frequency thump, rumble that you hear when just the mechanical noise that the keys make. I'm not into that. So I'm going to have to figure out a solution for that. But honestly, I'd like to, because I love this microphone. I hope this was helpful for you. I will do some other microphones over the course of this season. Let me know what you'd like to hear in the comments, and we will see you next time. Thanks a lot.